My phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and the number on the screen said Belworth Home Furnishings, and I almost let it go to voicemail because I was elbow deep in a wedding proposal for a client, 42 pages of catering line items that needed to be finalized by Friday. But something made me pick up anyway, and that small decision changed the next 6 months of my life. The woman on the line introduced herself as Priya from the Belworth Fraud Verification Department, and she asked if I was Renata Solano-Kendrick, and I said yes, a little confused because I had never shopped at Belworth Home Furnishings in my life. I did not even know what they sold beyond the commercials with the woman in the linen apron arranging throw pillows. She asked me to confirm a purchase of $11,400 made that morning at their downtown location, a full living room set, a dining table with 8 chairs, a custom sectional, and what she called a decorative package. And I remember laughing, actually laughing out loud into the phone, because I thought it was some kind of scam call, the kind where they try to get you panicked enough to give up your card number. "Ma'am, I think you have the wrong person," I said, still half laughing, still half typing an email to my client about chafing dish rentals. "I have a Belworth store card opened in your name 6 weeks ago," Priya said, and her voice had that careful, practiced calm that customer service people use when they already suspect they are about to deliver bad news. With a $14,000 credit limit, and it's currently at 81% utilization. I'm required to verify large purchases over $10,000 before we release the furniture for delivery. And this one flagged because the delivery address doesn't match the billing address on file. I stopped typing. "I don't have a Belworth card," I said, and my voice did not sound like laughing anymore. "The application was submitted online on June the 4th, she said, and I could hear her keys clicking. Under the name Renata Solano-Kendrick, with a social security number ending in 4471, date of birth March 19th, and an email address. Would you like me to read it to you?" She read it to me. It was my social security number. It was my birthday. The email address was not mine. It was a Gmail account I had never seen in my life, R. Kendrick Home 88, and when she said the delivery address, my stomach dropped straight through the floor of my kitchen. Because I recognized it immediately, it was my sister-in-law Whitley's apartment on Larkspur Avenue, Unit 4C, the place she had moved into 4 months earlier after her lease in the old complex fell through. I did not say anything for a long moment. Priya asked if I was still there. "I'm here," I said. "I need you to cancel that delivery. I need you to freeze that account right now, and I need to know everything on it." She told me she could not release full details over the phone for security reasons, that I would need to file a fraud claim. But she confirmed the account was open, active, 81% maxed, and that the furniture, all $11,400 of it, was sitting on a Belworth delivery truck 3 blocks from my sister-in-law's apartment, waiting for a signature to unload. My husband Grant and I had been saving for 4 years to buy our first house together. We had a closing date locked in for the 2nd week of September, 6 weeks away. I had spent those 4 years building my credit score from the low 600s, back when I was 26, and had defaulted on a car loan after a bad breakup left me holding a lease I could not afford alone, all the way up to a 781. A number I was, if I am honest, a little proud of, because I had built it one on-time payment at a time, one paid-off balance at a time. While running my own catering and event business from a rented commercial kitchen and a beat-up cargo van with my company name, Solano Table, stenciled on the side in gold vinyl letters I had paid for myself the year the business finally turned a profit. And in 6 weeks, some stranger, or worse, someone who was not a stranger at all, had opened a $14,000 line of credit in my name and run it up to the edge, right as I needed my credit report to be as clean and boring as humanly possible. Have you ever had someone in your own family cross a line like this and then act like you're the one overreacting? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next in my house is going to make you want to throw something. Let me back up, though, because you need to understand who Whitley is, and you need to understand my mother-in-law Deandra, and you need to understand exactly what kind of family I married into before you can understand why this phone call did not come as a total surprise to me, even though the size of it absolutely did. My name is Renata. I am 39 years old, and I grew up in Bakersfield, California, the oldest of 4 kids raised by a single mother who cleaned offices at night and sold tamales out of a cooler on weekends to make rent. I learned 2 things from my mother that shaped my entire adult life. The first was that nobody was coming to save me, and the second was that food, done with care and generosity, was one of the only languages that could make a hard day feel like a soft one. I put myself through community college working banquet shifts at a hotel downtown, and by the time I was 28, I had saved enough to buy a used van and start Solano Table, a small catering company that specialized in weddings, quinceañeras, and corporate events that wanted food that actually tasted like something instead of steam tray chicken. By the time I met Grant Kendrick, I was 31, and Solano Table had 4 full-time employees and a wait list. Grant was an electrical engineer, quiet, steady, the kind of man who reads the instructions before assembling furniture, which should have told me something important about the family he came from, because as it turned out, nobody else in that family read instructions for anything, financial or otherwise. We got married when I was 33. His mother, Deandra Kendrick, was polite to me at the wedding in the particular way that some mothers-in-law are polite when they have already decided you are not quite what they pictured for their son, smiling with her mouth while her eyes did the math on my dress, my catering business, my Bakersfield accent that I have mostly smoothed out, but that still slips out when I am tired or angry. Grant's father, Walton, was easier, a retired postal worker who mostly wanted to talk about baseball and seemed relieved that his son had married someone who could hold a conversation and hold a grudge. His words, not mine, said with a wink at the rehearsal dinner. And then there was Whitley. Whitley is Grant's younger sister, 4 years younger, and from the very first family dinner I attended, I understood that Whitley occupied a specific role in that household, the role of the special one, the one who needed extra grace, extra patience, extra rescuing, because life had simply been harder on her, according to Deandra, than it had been on Grant. Whitley had struggled in school. Whitley had gone through a bad breakup in her 20s that Deandra referenced constantly, as though it were an injury that never fully healed and excused every subsequent decision. Whitley had bounced between 5 jobs in 6 years, each one ending with a story about how her boss was unreasonable, or her coworkers were jealous, or the company just was not a good fit for someone with her creative energy. And each time, Deandra and Walton quietly covered her rent for a month or 2 until the next job started. I want to be fair here, because this is not a story where I am the perfect person and everyone else is a villain, and I have had to sit with that honestly over the past several months. Whitley is not a bad person. She is funny, she is warm when she wants to be, she showed up for me when my mother had her hip surgery 2 years ago and drove 4 hours to sit in a waiting room with me she did not have to sit in. But Whitley also had a lifelong pattern, one I watched from the outside for 6 years before any of this happened, of believing that money problems were things that happened to other people permanently, and to her only temporarily, that a crisis today did not require a real plan tomorrow because someone, usually her mother, usually eventually her brother, would smooth it over. The tension between Whitley and me had always lived under the surface, polite but present, mostly around money, because I was the one in the family who had built something from nothing and did not believe in smoothing things over. I remember a Thanksgiving 3 years back when Whitley asked to borrow $800 for a car repair, and I said no, gently, but no, and explained that if she needed help, I would rather help her build a real budget than hand her cash. And Deandra had looked at me across the table like I had suggested we leave Whitley on the side of the highway. "We're a family," Deandra said, in that soft, wounded voice she used when she wanted you to feel like the villain in your own house. Family helps family. That's not how Renata's people do things, I suppose, but that's how we do things. Renata's people, I have never forgotten that phrase. Grant, to his credit at the time, told his mother that was out of line. But he also did not push back hard enough, and looking back now, I understand that Grant had spent his whole life in a house where confronting Deendra directly cost more than it was worth. So he learned to deflect and soften and let things go. And I loved him enough that for years I let things go too, because picking every single battle would have meant picking a battle every single week. I had a business to run and a marriage to build, and I genuinely believed that if I just kept my own finances separate and clean and boring, none of Whitley's chaos could ever actually touch me. I was wrong about that, and Priya from Belworth Home Furnishings was the phone call that proved it. After I hung up with her, I sat at my kitchen table for exactly 4 minutes without moving, and then I called Grant. He was between meetings and picked up on the second ring, and I told him, as calmly as I could manage, what had just happened. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I said his name twice. "There has to be a mistake," he finally said. "Whitley wouldn't do that." I want you to notice that sentence because it is going to matter a lot later. Whitley wouldn't do that. Not, "That's insane, let's find out what happened." Not, "I'm coming home right now." His first instinct, his very first instinct, was to defend her before he had a single fact. "Grant," I said, "she is my birthday, my social security number, and my legal name on a card being delivered to her apartment. This is not a mistake." He came home early. We sat at the table together and I pulled up my credit report, which had refreshed that morning, and there it was, a new account, Belworth Home Furnishings Credit Services, opened June 4th, credit limit $14,000, balance $9,231, which meant Whitley had made other purchases before today's furniture order, smaller ones, the kind that would not trigger a fraud verification call. I clicked into the details with hands that were not entirely steady and saw a hard inquiry that had also dinged my score 4 points, small in isolation. But my score had already dropped from an 802 down to a 778 in the weeks before I even knew this card existed, and I had spent those same weeks confused and mildly annoyed, assuming it was some kind of algorithm quirk, never once suspecting the truth. $9,000 in purchases before today. I started scrolling through what I could see: a mattress, a television 65 inches, kitchenware, a rug described as hand-woven jute, oversized. Whitley had been furnishing her entire apartment, piece by piece, on credit that was legally mine for 6 weeks, and I had had absolutely no idea. Grant called Whitley. She did not answer. He called again. Nothing. He texted her, and I watched over his shoulder as 3 dots appeared and disappeared 4 separate times before she finally wrote back, "Can we talk later? I am driving." "She's not driving," I said. "She's standing in her apartment watching an $11,000 delivery truck idle outside because she can't figure out what to tell them." I was right, as it turned out, though I did not know it yet. We drove to Whitley's apartment that evening, both of us, because Grant insisted on being there and I insisted on going too. Because if this conversation was going to happen without me in the room, I did not trust that the version relayed back to me would be the true one. When Whitley opened the door, her face went through 4 expressions in under 2 seconds: surprise, then something like relief that it was us and not the police, then a kind of practiced apologetic softness. And finally, when neither of us softened back, something closer to defensiveness. "Before you say anything," she said, stepping back to let us in, "I was going to pay it back." Behind her, in the small living room, I could see a partially assembled sectional sofa, still wrapped in plastic on one end, a new television mounted on the wall, boxes stacked in the corner that had clearly not even been opened yet. It did not look like a woman in crisis. It looked like a showroom. "Whitley," Grant said, and his voice was doing that thing where it tries to sound calm and stern at once and mostly sounds tired. "Explain this to me. All of it." She sat down on the arm of the still plastic-wrapped sofa and told us in pieces, punctuated by a lot of "you have to understand." And I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. That back in the spring, when she had come to the house for a family dinner, she had used the printer in Grant's home office to print something for a job application. And while she was in there, she had come across a folder, an old one, from 3 years earlier. When Grant and I had briefly explored buying a duplex with his parents as a joint investment property before deciding against it. A folder that had photocopies of both of our IDs, our social security cards, and a joint bank statement we had shared with a mortgage broker at the time and never properly shredded. "I wasn't looking for it," she said. "It was right there." "And you took a photo of my social security card," I said, and it was not a question. She did not answer that directly. Instead, she said that she had been in a really hard place, that her hours had been cut at the boutique where she were. Ked, that her new apartment had come completely unfurnished after her last relationship ended, and she had left most of the furniture with her ex, that she had felt embarrassed inviting anyone over, that Deendra had been saying for months how she wanted the whole family to start doing more get-togethers at Whitley's new place once it was put together properly. And that the pressure of it, the shame of having nothing to offer, of being 35 and starting completely over again, had built up until one night, scrolling through Bellworth's website at 2 a.m, she had told herself it was just an application, just to see, and when it approved instantly for $14,000, something in her word, snapped, and she started buying. "I was going to pay every cent back before it ever showed up on your report," she said. "I have a system. I've been saving from my paychecks." I asked her how much she had saved so far, in 6 weeks, toward the $9,000 she already owed before today's furniture order pushed it past $11,000. She looked at the floor. "About $400, she said. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I have watched enough of these family confrontation videos myself to know that people expect yelling, and there was no yelling. There was just a very cold, very clear feeling settling into my chest, the feeling of understanding exactly how much someone was willing to gamble with your entire financial life for their own comfort. "I want you to call Bellworth tonight," I said, "and cancel today's delivery. Then tomorrow morning, you and I are going to sit down together and you are going to help me file a police report and an FTC identity theft report, because that is what this is, Whitley. It's not borrowing, it's identity theft. I don't care that we're family. The law doesn't have a family exception." Whitley's face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her, until she said the sentence that undid whatever softness I had left that night. "You're really going to call the police on your own sister-in-law over furniture?" "I'm going to call the police," I said, "because someone stole my identity 6 weeks before I close on a house, and I need every piece of paper trail I can get to fix it, and if that person happens to be my sister-in-law, that is a fact about the crime, not a reason to skip reporting it." Grant, to his credit, did not defend her in that moment. He sat very still, his jaw tight, and when Whitley turned to him, looking for the rescue she was used to getting, he simply said, "She's right. This is serious, Whit. This isn't like the car repair money." We left without a resolution that night, mostly because Whitley refused to call Bellworth in front of us, insisting she needed time to process. And I remember sitting in the passenger seat of Grant's car in the parking lot of her apartment complex, staring at the delivery truck still idling near the entrance, and calling Bellworth myself, canceling the delivery under my own authority as the account holder of record. Listening to the confirmation number repeat back to me twice, because my hands were shaking too hard to write it the first time. The next morning, I woke up before 6 and made a list, because that is what I do when the ground feels unstable under me. I make lists. It is the same instinct that built Solano Table from a cargo van into a company with a wait list. The belief that any chaos can be organized into steps if you are willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to write them down. My list had 11 items. Freeze all 3 credit bureaus. File a report with the FTC's identity theft website. File a police report in person, not over the phone, because Bellworth's fraud department had told me a police report would carry more weight for the dispute. Call our mortgage broker and explain what had happened before it showed up as a surprise on his end. Send Belworth written, notice disputing every charge on the account. Request the account be closed and the fraudulent inquiry removed from my credit file. Change every password I had that touched anything financial. Request copies of the original application from Belworth to see exactly what information had been submitted and see if I could match Whitley's IP address or device to it. Call our homeowner's insurance agent because we had bundled some things and I wanted to make sure nothing else was compromised. Call my own mother because I needed one phone call that day that was not about fixing something. And the 11th item, the one I stared at longest before writing it down, was simply decide what accountability actually looks like. Because I do not want revenge, I want this to never happen again, to me or to anyone else in this family. I spent that entire day at the police station and on hold with Belworth's fraud line. And by 4 p.m, I had a police report. Number, an FTC identity theft report with a recovery plan attached, and a case number with Belworth's fraud investigation team, who told me the dispute process for the fraudulent account would take between 30 and 90 days. Information that made me feel like the floor had opened again. Because closing on our house was in 6 weeks, and mortgage lenders do not love pending fraud disputes showing up mid-process. Our mortgage broker, a patient man named Desmond who had walked us through every step of the process for the past 4 months, was calm on the phone but honest. It's not necessarily a deal-breaker, he said. If we can document it clearly as fraud in progress with a police report and a formal dispute, underwriters have seen this before. But I won't lie to you, Renata, it adds risk. And if the utilization on that account gets reported to the bureaus again before it's resolved, it could shift your debt-to-income ratio enough to affect your rate lock or even your approval. We need this cleaned up fast. I hung up with him and sat in my parked car outside the police station and let myself cry for exactly 6 minutes, because I had earned that much. And then I wiped my face, reapplied lip balm because some habits do not care about your emotional state, and drove to my in-laws' house, because I was done letting this conversation happen in pieces, in someone else's living room, on someone else's timeline. Deandra opened the door before I even knocked, which told me Grant had called ahead, and her face had the particular arranged calm of a woman who had already decided what version of this story she was going to believe. "Renata," she said, "come in, sit down, let's all just talk this through like a family." I sat down. Walton was in his recliner, silent, watching a baseball game with the sound low, clearly present for support but not for combat. Grant sat beside me, close enough that his knee touched mine. Whitley was not there yet, which I found out was intentional, because Deandra wanted to talk to me first, and I understood within the first 90 seconds exactly why. "I want you to understand," Deandra began, folding her hands in her lap like she was about to deliver a eulogy, "that Whitley has been through an incredibly hard year. The breakup with Marcus took a lot out of her. Losing her hours at the boutique took a lot out of her. And I think, in her own way, she was trying to build something for herself, a home, after feeling like she had nothing. And I know what she did was wrong. I'm not saying it wasn't wrong. But I need you to have some compassion here, Renata, before you go calling the police on your own family." "I already called the police," I said. "Yesterday, there's a report." Deandra's face flickered, genuine surprise and something colder underneath it. "You already did that, without talking to us first." "Deandra," I said, and I made myself keep my voice level. "Someone opened a $14,000 line of credit using my social security number, without my knowledge or consent, and ran it up to over $11,000 in 6 weeks, 6 weeks before I close on a house. That is a federal crime. I did not need to talk to anyone first to know that reporting a crime is the correct response to a crime." "She's family," Deandra said, and her voice cracked a little, the first real crack I had seen. "She's not some stranger who stole your purse. Doesn't that count for anything? Are you really willing to let this ruin her life over furniture?" And this is the part I want you to really sit with, because it took me a long time to be able to say this next thing out loud without shaking. The fact that she's family, I said, is exactly why this is worse, not better. A stranger doesn't have my birthday memorized. A stranger doesn't know where I keep old documents. A stranger doesn't get invited to my house for Thanksgiving. She used the access that being family gave her to do something a stranger couldn't have done. That's not a reason for less accountability. That's the reason for more. Deandra did not have a response to that, not right away, and in the silence, Grant finally spoke. And what he said mattered a great deal to me, because it was the first time in 6 years of marriage I had watched him choose a side out loud in his mother's own living room. "Mom," he said, "Renata's right. I love Whitley. I want to help her. But what she did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, and it was a choice that could cost us our house. I need you to stop making this about Renata being harsh. This isn't about compassion versus cruelty. It's about whether Whitley is going to actually be accountable or whether we're all going to keep pretending nothing happened until the next time." Would have gone here if I hadn't already placed it earlier. But let me tell you, in that living room with Walton finally muting the baseball game, I felt something shift, small but real, the first crack of light in a room that had been dark for a very long time. Whitley arrived 20 minutes later, and the conversation that followed took almost 2 hours, and I am not going to walk you through every minute of it, because a lot of it was circular, Whitley alternating between genuine tears and defensive justifications, Deandra alternating between defending her daughter and slowly, uncomfortably, starting to hear herself. But there were 2 things that came out that evening that changed the entire shape of this story, and I need to tell you both of them. The first was that this was not, in fact, the first time. 6 years earlier, before I had even met Grant, Whitley had done something disturbingly similar to a family friend named Corrine, an older woman who had been close with Deandra since church, who had let Whitley house sit, and had, it came out that night, had a credit card statement go briefly missing during that stay, followed by unexplained charges that Corrine herself never fully pursued because Deandra had personally intervened, paid Corrine back in cash to keep the peace, and asked her not to make a formal report because it would destroy Whitley's future. Grant had never known the full story, only a vague version he had been told at the time, that Whitley had borrowed Corrine's card without asking and paid her back. Hearing the real version, sitting 3 feet from his mother, his face went through something I had never seen on him before, a kind of grief, I think, grief for the version of his family he had believed in. "You covered for her," Grant said to his mother very quietly, "6 years ago, and you never told me the truth." Deandra's hands were shaking. "I thought I was protecting her," she said. "I thought if I just handled it quietly, she'd learn her lesson and it would never happen again." "She just did it again," I said, to me, for $14,000 instead of whatever it was with Corrine. Handling it quietly didn't teach her a lesson, Deandra. It taught her that quiet handling was available if she ever needed it again. The second thing that came out that night was harder for me to hear, in a different way, because it made Whitley into a more complicated person than the villain I had been picturing for the past 30 hours. She admitted, crying in a way that did not feel performed anymore, that losing her hours at the boutique had actually meant losing the job entirely 3 weeks earlier. Something she had not told anyone, not even Deandra, because she had been too ashamed, that she had been unemployed and quietly panicking, applying to jobs and getting nothing, watching her savings account, which had never been large, dwindle toward zero, and that somewhere in that spiral. Furnishing the apartment had become a strange kind of anchor, something she could control and point to and feel like a functional adult about, even while everything else in her life felt like it was slipping away. "I know that doesn't make it okay," she said. "I know, but I need you to know I wasn't just being greedy. I was drowning, and I grabbed the thing that made me feel less like I was drowning, and I didn't think about what it would cost you until the phone started ringing yesterday, and I realized what I'd actually done to someone who's never been anything but decent to me. I did not forgive her that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this sometimes rush the forgiveness in a way that makes it feel cheap. And I did not feel anything close to forgiveness sitting on that couch. I felt exhausted and betrayed and worried sick about my house closing. but I did feel something shift in how I understood what had happened, from a simple story about a spoiled sister-in-law helping herself to my identity, into a more complicated story about a family that had spent decades teaching one of its members that consequences were optional and love was measured in cover-ups, and about a woman who had absorbed that lesson so completely that she reached for identity theft the way another person might reach for a bottle of wine, as a coping mechanism dressed up as a solution. That did not make it less serious. If anything, understanding the why made me more certain about what needed to happen next, because covering for Whitley again, the way Deandra had covered for her with Kareen, would not have been compassion. It would have been the same failure repeating itself in a new outfit. I laid out what I needed that night in that living room with all four of them listening, and I did it calmly because I had spent the entire day organizing my thoughts into that list, and this was item 11. Here is what has to happen, I said. First, Whitley, you are going to give a full written statement to Belworth's fraud department confirming that you opened the account and made every purchase. So my dispute isn't a he said, she said, it's a documented fact, and that statement needs to happen this week, not whenever you feel ready, because my house closing depends on this account being resolved fast. Second, you are going to pay back every dollar, all of it not to me, because legally the fraud dispute should zero out my liability once it's processed, but to Belworth directly or to whatever restitution the police report ultimately requires, and I want a real plan, in writing, with actual numbers, not a promise. Third, you are going to get financial counseling, an actual certified counselor, not a podcast, because this is not the first time, and I am not interested in a version of accountability that lasts exactly as long as this crisis is scary and then fades once things calm down. And fourth, and this one is for everyone in this room, nobody touches my documents, my information, or my finances ever again without my direct permission. And if I ever hear the words family helps family used to excuse taking something from me without asking, I am walking out of that conversation, and I will not be walking back in quickly. Deandra started to say something, and I held up a hand, gently but firmly. I need you to hear the rest of this too, Deandra. You knew about Kareen. You covered it up instead of getting Whitley help, and I understand you thought you were protecting her, but you were actually protecting the pattern, not your daughter. If you want to be part of rebuilding trust in this family, that starts with you being honest, out loud, about what you did 6 years ago, and it continues with you respecting the boundary I just laid out, completely, not as a suggestion you get to renegotiate every few months when it's inconvenient. The room was quiet for a long moment. Walton, who had said almost nothing all evening, finally spoke, his voice rough. She's right, Deandra, he said. About all of it, we should have handled Kareen differently. I went along with it because you asked me to, and I've regretted it for years, and I never said anything because it felt easier not to. I'm sorry, Renata, I should have said something a long time ago. That apology, small as it was, coming from a man who had barely spoken all night, did something to loosen the knot in my chest that had been tightening since Priya's phone call the day before. Over the next 2 weeks, the machinery of fixing what had been broken moved forward on 2 tracks at once, and both of them mattered. On the practical track, Whitley did, to her credit, follow through faster than I expected. She gave Belworth a full written statement within 4 days, admitting to opening the account, submitting fraudulent identity documents, and making every purchase without my knowledge. A statement that, combined with my police report and FTC filing, gave Belworth's fraud team what they needed to open a formal internal investigation. The furniture that had already been delivered before the fraud call, the mattress, the television, the kitchenware, presented a complication, because Belworth's policy required that fraudulently obtained goods either be returned or that restitution be arranged. And Whitley, unable to afford to simply hand back a mattress she was sleeping on and a television she needed for the unemployment interviews she was now conducting by video, worked out a payment plan directly with Belworth's collections department. Cosigned by nobody, in her own name, transferring the debt for the goods she intended to keep out of my identity entirely and into her own. A process that took some negotiating on Bellworth's part, but that their fraud investigator, a surprisingly patient man named Oscar, told me was not unusual once fraud was clearly documented and the actual purchaser was willing to take ownership. On my end, the dispute for the fraudulent inquiry and the closed account moved through all 3 credit bureaus over the following 5 weeks. Slower than I wanted, faster than the 90 days Bellworth had originally quoted, because a documented police report combined with a signed confession from the actual perpetrator apparently accelerates these things considerably. My credit score, which had dipped to 778 in the confusion, actually recovered to 795 once the fraudulent account was formally removed rather than merely closed, because a removed account does not carry the same weight as a closed one with a maxed balance. Desmond, our mortgage broker, walked us through submitting a letter of explanation to the underwriter, along with copies of the police report and the FTC identity theft affidavit. And 3 weeks before our closing date, he called to tell me the underwriter had accepted the documentation, and our approval was moving forward as originally planned. I sat down on my kitchen floor when he told me that, actual floor, because my legs did not feel steady enough to stay standing, and I called Grant at work crying. And for once they were not the exhausted, angry tears I had been crying for 2 weeks, they were the other kind. But the second track, the accountability track, mattered just as much to me, maybe more, because a resolved credit dispute fixes a number, and I needed something that would fix a family. Whitley started seeing a financial counselor through a nonprofit credit counseling service in early July, and to her enormous credit, she did not treat it like a box to check for my benefit. I know this because Grant went with her to 2 sessions, at her invitation, not mine, and came home describing a woman actually confronting, out loud, in front of a professional, the specific belief system she had inherited, that crisis justified shortcuts, that someone would always eventually smooth things over, that asking for help meant admitting failure, so instead she reached for control in whatever form was available, even a stolen credit line. The counselor also gently pushed her toward individual therapy, separate from the financial counseling, because the pattern underneath the spending, the shame spiral after job loss, the compulsive need to project stability she did not feel, was not something a budgeting worksheet alone was going to solve. And Whitley, somewhat to my surprise, actually started seeing a therapist that August, someone she found through her counselor's referral list, someone she has now been seeing weekly for months. Deindra's accountability took a different shape, slower, more uncomfortable to watch, because unlearning a decades-long instinct to protect her daughter from consequences was, I think, one of the harder things she has ever had to do. But she did it in pieces. She called Corrine, the family friend from 6 years earlier, and told her the truth, apologized properly for asking her to stay quiet, and offered to help repay whatever remained unresolved from that old incident. An offer Corrine, who is apparently a genuinely gracious woman, mostly declined but appreciated deeply, telling Deindra it meant more to hear the truth after 6 years than any check ever could have. Deindra also, in early August, sat across from me at a coffee shop, just the 2 of us, something that had never happened once in 6 years of marriage, and told me, without qualifiers, without pivoting to defend Whitley halfway through, that she had spent Whitley's whole life confusing rescue with love, that she had done it because her own mother had been harsh and withholding, and she had promised herself she would never make her children feel that unsupported, and that in trying to avoid one mistake, she had built a completely different one, and that watching Grant's face in her living room that night, watching him say, "You never told me the truth," had broken something open in her that she was still working through. "I'm not asking you to forget any of this," she said, stirring a coffee she was not drinking. "I know that's not fair to ask. I'm asking you to let me show you over time that I heard what you said, about the documents, about the boundaries, I mean it." I told her that was, actually, exactly the right thing to ask for, because I did not want an apology that tried to skip ahead to being forgiven. I wanted proof, over time, the same thing I was asking of Whitley. Grant, for his part, had his own reckoning to sit with, one that I think was quieter but no less real. About 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, on a night when we were lying in bed unable to sleep, he told me he had been thinking about all the small moments over the years where he had watched his mother excuse Whitley's behavior and said nothing, had watched me push back and privately agreed with me but stayed silent in the room, had told himself that staying neutral was the peacekeeping move, when really, he said, staying neutral had just meant leaving me alone to be the only person in the family willing to hold a boundary, over and over again, for 6 years. I let you be the bad guy by yourself, he said in the dark, so many times. I'm not doing that again. I should have been standing next to you a long time before Belworth called. That admission mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened during those months. Because a marriage, I have come to believe, is not tested by the crisis itself, but by whether your partner shows up inside it as an actual partner. And Grant, after a rocky first day, did show up consistently for the rest of it, sitting beside me at the police station when I went back to file a supplemental report, driving me to the bank when I needed notarized copies of documents, calling his mother himself, without me prompting him, twice, to have hard conversations I did not have to referee. We closed on our house on the second Tuesday of September, exactly on schedule, in a small conference room with Desmond grinning at us across the table. And I remember signing the final page and feeling a wave of relief so physical it made my hands shake, not because the number on the page was intimidating, we had prepared for that for years, but because 6 weeks earlier, I genuinely had not known if this day would happen at all. We hosted our first family dinner in the new house in late October, and I want to tell you about that dinner, because it is the ending this story deserves, even though it was not a perfect, tidy ending, because real ones rarely are. Whitley arrived with a small gift, wrapped in brown paper, tied with plain string, nothing showy, and when I opened it, it was a set of hand-thrown ceramic serving bowls from a local potter. The kind of thing that costs real money but nowhere near the kind of money that used to characterize her gestures, and taped to the bottom of one bowl was a small folded note that said, "Bought with my own actual paycheck. First one from the new job, 3 months clean on the payment plan. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I would have understood if you had." She had gotten a new job in September, an administrative role at a dental office, steady hours, benefits, nothing glamorous, and she had been making her payments to Belworth on time every single month since July, small amounts, $150 a month. A plan that would take her almost 5 years to pay off in full. A plan she had chosen herself, over my suggestion of a faster timeline, because, she told me, she needed the length of it to actually feel the weight of what she had done, rather than rushing through it, and calling herself even. Deandra brought a dish to that dinner too, her mother's old recipe for a pork stew she had never once in 6 years offered to bring to anything I hosted, always assuming, I think, that a caterer's house did not need outside contributions. And when she set it on the counter, she said, quietly just to me in the kitchen, "I know this doesn't undo anything. I just wanted to bring something, for once, instead of only taking up space in your kitchen and having opinions about it." I laughed, actually laughed, the first easy laugh I had shared with Deandra in 6 years, and told her the stew smelled incredible and meant it. Over dinner, Walton raised a glass, an actual toast, which was not a thing he did, being a man who mostly communicated through baseball commentary and quiet presence, and he said, "To Renata, for holding a line the rest of us should have helped her hold a long time ago. And to all of us for finally listening." Whitley's eyes filled up, and she reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back, and it was not forgiveness arriving in a single dramatic moment. It was something slower and more honest than that. It was the beginning of trust actually being rebuilt, brick by brick, the same way I had built my credit score all those years ago, one on-time payment at a time. It has been 4 months since that dinner as I am telling you this. Whitley is still in therapy, still making her payments, still checking in with her financial counselor monthly. Deandra has not touched a single document of mine, has asked permission for the smallest things, has started, slowly, building an actual relationship with me that does not run entirely through Grant. My credit score sits at 811 now, the fraudulent account long gone from my report, replaced by a mortgage payment I make every month from a house that very nearly slipped through my fingers, because someone I trusted decided my identity was easier to borrow than to ask for help honestly. Grant and I are stronger, not despite what happened, but because of how we walked through it together once he finally stood all the way beside me instead of in the careful middle ground he used to think was neutral. I do not know if I will ever fully stop double-checking my credit report the way I do now, monthly, on the same day every month, a habit born out of 6 weeks of genuine fear. But I do know that the family I sit across the dinner table with now is more honest than the one I married into, because it finally had to be. Do you think trust, once broken by someone in your own family, can ever be fully rebuilt, or does it always leave some kind of scar behind, even after the healing? I would really love to hear where you land on that, so let me know in the comments below.